I suppose what I'd like to do really is to stretch from sexual behaviour into sexual violence.
Yeah, I don't understand that. I don't understand rape and stuff like that.
Precisely, and as any normally oriented heterosexual man, I would suggest that if you're getting your jollies from watching rape scene porn, then there's probably something that you might want to go and get a bit of therapy about. Because it ain't
absolutely.
normal. I'm telling you that shit ain't normal. I suppose we're defining a lot of natural sexual behaviour, and we have broached upon the subject of victims being made into abusers, and that this is again going back to my point of the difference between consensual sexual behaviour and sexual violence, and it essentially is as simple as that. If it's not consensual sexual behaviour, it's sexual violence.
It is violence.
Guys, get that in your head, because you can be halfway through a shag and the girl goes, "Oh, I've changed my mind." It changes to sexual violence at that point.
Yeah, stop it.
Yeah?
Agreed.
If the person who is agreeing to the consensual sex act is under an age where they can knowingly consent or understand the consequences of that consent, it's not a consensual sex act. It becomes sexual violence, an act of sexual violence. An act of sexual violence can be have a real wide range, from an abusive husband who simply foul-mouths his wife and then expects them to perform a sex act immediately afterwards. That's an act of sexual violence.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
But also, from in that range of behaviour, we then also go to the object rape of babies. This is not a sex act. You know what I mean? This is really where this is simply an act of violence. We remove the sexual violence part from the sexual part from the violence, and we now enter into a field of pure violence.
Just violence.
But this is still held in the public domain as part of the overarching umbrella of paedophilia that the old It's the Knockout guy got his sentence for, you know what I mean? Okay, meddling with young girls is completely unacceptable, but it's sexual violence of a completely different nature to the, you know what I mean, violent physical rape of a very young minor.
Yeah,
it's a hugely different act. And as such, there are actually very specific terms. I should actually have pulled one of my bits of research that completely dropped off my head was to put up a list of all of the scientific terminology for all of the various sexual proclivities. And there are very specific terminologies for all of the Stuart Hall type behaviours and the Lolita type situations. The nursery nurse who was filming herself abusing 2-year-olds to sell, you know what I mean, through her husband. You know what I mean? There are specific terms for these, and the fact that these are all in the public domain as pedo.
Yeah.
Sexual self-loathing, I think, is an incredibly important
does that go hand in hand with Catholic guilt?
Well, I think that Catholic guilt is certainly an expression of sexual self-loathing, and is a very clear, sort of commonplace, well-understood mechanism of the dogma of the Catholic Church, and the way that dogma is prosecuted through the priesthood and issued out to the congregation in great measure. That essentially we have a religion that describes as sinful and excludes from the faithful to do without sin a great swathe of completely natural human behaviour.
Yeah.
And so, yes, in Catholic cultures, you do have some quite remarkable levels of sexual deviance,
messed up minds.
Well, this is basically my point: is that sexual deviance can be entered into fully consensually and by somebody whose sexual orientation is completely natural, normalised, and they then engage into more and more unusual areas of sexual activity, possibly even stepping outside of the realms of their own naturalised sexual orientation. Straight men experimenting with gay sex. Personally, I find that very hard to understand what steps you would have to go through as a straight, naturally oriented heterosexual man to desire the experience of homosexual sex. But this is.
Have you ever had a homosexual experience, or even wanted one?
No.
Right.
The nearest I ever came to it was my best friend admitting that he'd fancied me for years and that he was covering up his homosexuality to all his girlfriends.
Right, okay. The nearest I've had to it is when I dance a lot on the dance floor and people just presume I'm gay.
Well, funny you should mention that, Sean, but that was one of the reasons why I particularly wanted to cover this subject with you, because as somebody who is not the big strapping lad spectrum of masculinity, but as a straight man, wife and children, you will have probably have received enough of the bullshit assumptions that people make about your sexual orientation to have been forced to have considered this subject a bit more broadly than most people do. Certainly more broadly than most men do.
It's quite constant. I mean, obviously.
Well, there you go. And you and I both, largely, I think from my perspective, it was more because I found myself so unbelievably normal, so unbelievably absent of all of the sexual hang-ups that everybody else seemed to be acquiring, and that all of the media spent their entire life describing or fantasizing.
Yeah.
And I found the whole thing, to a degree, a perversion of the natural expression of sexuality that I personally experienced. And that fascinated me. That fascinated me why, normal was so normal, and yet so few people seem to be able to achieve this kind of normal happiness, this normal expression of their own biology, being comfortable in their own skin. And that was when I began to research what presented itself to me was over and over again was early sexual trauma. And that early sexual trauma, be it homosexual or heterosexual, a lot of the girlfriends that I'd had undergone rape at an early age by some male member of the household. And their sexualities were shrapnelled.
Yes.
I mean, they did. So they didn't know whether they were coming or going. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. They didn't know whether they wanted you to beat them at the point of orgasm or, kick you off and tell you to get out the door.
Yeah. No. Yes, I understand. I understand. Where you're coming from.
when you take that to homosexual rape of a child. When you start to look into what that does to the primordial formative libido of the boy child that's experienced rape, especially because of the when you start to approach puberty, if you're still being victimized in this way, there's an distinct likelihood that pressure on the oh, God. What's the gland up your arse that the doctor always wants to stick his finger up your arse to check?
Oh, that one. Yeah, okay, I don't know.
Yeah, that one. Well, the pressure due to the rape on that gland can stimulate an autoerotic orgasm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is actually how farmers milk the semen out of balls if they can't wank them off.
Okay. But look,
it's very important. A very key understanding is that in that formative, prepubescent, transitional pubescent boy's mind, that moment of orgasm may be his first moment of orgasm, and it may happen during homosexual rape.
Right.
Now, that moment will immediately be associated in that formative libidinous mind to be what sex is. Right. And therein lies the fucking goddamn problem.
Right.
Is because all of those victims then go on to have an entire life where what sex is exactly what sex isn't.
Well, what I was going to say to you, okay, and it is totally as relevant as I was going to say it just then. I wasn't meaning to cut across here. How rife is this fucking raping and deviant sexual behaviour going on? Because just like you, but prior to getting married, I had a lot of sexual partners. I fell in love all the time, basically, Jack. Okay. That's how I was. That's how I am.
Yeah, moving from one lover to the next.
Absolutely.
Monogamous.
Yeah, but this is the situation. An awful lot of them had problems and were either victims of some form of abuse.
Well, this is
how
where
rife is it?
Well, my monarch research into the elite's use of sexual perversions and sexual deviances as a control system for the various people that are fostered into power as part of our sort of ruling elite. And I began to do some fairly basic maths using the sort of very most roughest statistics we have available to us, which are probably hugely underreported. But just simply using those statistics, it was very clear to see that because of this 1 in 10 value of victims who experience abuse to victims that then go on to become abusers because of learnt behaviour. And if you think about an adult pedophilic male, he can never have a life partner. His sexual orientation is young children. Well, young children only stay young for a very short time. So even if they select a victim who they repeatedly abuse over a number of years, all abuse victims who have been in this position describe the moment at which they are too old, at which they're now worn out, served their usefulness. They're now no longer pretty enough in their abuser's mind. And then the abuser has to go out and get another victim. Well, if that age range is quite narrow, which it quite often is in many of these sort of violent sexual predators, if that age range is quite narrow, then you will need a raft of victims over a lifespan that will produce an exponential number of abusers because of this 1 in 10 value. If an abuser abuses 1,000 children in their abusive, in their active abusive lifespan, then that's 100 times they've multiplied their abuse. Yeah, there'll be 100 of their victims that will then go on, and even if they don't go on to perform pedophilic acts, I mean, this is the other thing as well, is that the victims going on to abuse isn't a simple matter of transference of the act that was done to them, they then pursue on somebody else. It's also all of the domestic violence, the marital breakup, the marital violence, all of the subsidiary violence that falls out of an abuser's life after being abused.
Yeah.
So essentially we have an exponential factor here. And on a rough calculation of where sort of the Profumo affair and the simple adulterous sexual behaviour of a public figure was last used to remove a public figure from office. Well, after the Profumo affair, really, we have the sexual revolution of the 60s, and after that, really, a minor affair, you know what I mean, or even a mistress. We've got, you know what I mean, French president went through an entire bloody presidency with his wife and his mistress in the public domain. So having a mistress, having affairs is no longer a control mechanism. So the control mechanism had to be stepped up. And now the only way that you're going to get into the halls of power is if you're into sadomasochism. Yeah, or, you know what I mean, if you happen to have a proclivity for prostitutes of a particular nature. if you happen to like children, even
That's
better.
the one, yeah.
And
so
again, I think as the
so these are controlling mechanisms.
Yeah, well, I think that as the sexual revolution has progressed and more permissiveness has come out through society, that in order to be able to maintain this control mechanism, the ruling elite essentially have to be more and more perverse.
More deviant, yeah.
More deviant in order to be able to be accepted into my gang. And as a result, we see things like the Skull and Bones initiation that's been filmed from the rooftop of the neighbouring building, where they're acting out a violent rape and murder scene on a naked girl. And the girl is actually there, apparently acting out the scene. I mean, let's hope that it wasn't real, but even if they're only acting it out, what does that say about the Bushes and the Skull and Bones man?
Yeah.
About what they have to be in order to undergo that sort of initiation.
And it was the prostate gland we couldn't think of earlier.
Oh, prostate gland, yes, of course. Yeah, and this. Let's just pursue that as well. So again, we have this effect of homosexual pedophilic behaviour on young men as they approach adolescence, which can stimulate a physical orgasm and ejaculation. And because of the nature of the plasticity of a young man or woman's libido, that the auto-arousal due to the rape will be associated with the sex act from then on. And regardless of whether that person then goes on to pursue that perversion of their libido, I'm not talking about perversion, but the corruption of their natural pre-existing libido, even if they don't pursue that creation of a differentiated libido, this is what often then goes on to cause huge sort of marital problems. There's one of the couples that I've been working with, and I have to be very discreet here, but essentially I suspect that the man, while pursuing a lifestyle that is entirely heterosexual, was probably abused as a child, creating a homosexual-oriented libido, which, due to his cultural references, is abhorrent to him, and as such, he self-loathes his own libidinous drives towards the masculine form, and as a consequence is just trashing the lives of everybody around him and is in complete ignorance and denial of anything that's going on in his libido. And as a consequence is just a car crash happening permanently. And that this is another thing as well, is that when we talk about these paedophiles, when we talk about the victims of Jimmy Savile, what you have to realise is that as well as those direct victims, you have a whole raft of indirect victims. I'm not the victim of paedophilia, but I am most certainly the indirect victim of paedophilia. My life has been strafed persistently by the neuroses and the malformed behaviours due to the abuse that many of my kind of partners and friends and family have suffered. And when you extract that out to the rest of the general public, we're talking about possibly the greatest social problem facing us in this day and age, bar none.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard my piece with Carl from Canada and Eddie Goldtooth, where Carl is discussing his 11, 12 years as a Manchester beat copper.
That's going back quite a while, isn't it? That
it is going back a long while. But I asked him in that show, out of all of the sort of regulars that they used to see, did he know much about the sort of backstory of those regulars? And he said, at least 95% of all of the people that came through the door of the police station under arrest were either under social services due to abusive family situations, within the social services system in the children's home system, or just out-and-out runaways who were running away from abuse. And he said that the other 5% were just pissed people that had got into a fight on a Saturday night. So we basically have 100% of the criminality that a time-served British policeman witnessed in his time as a beat copper in Manchester, 100% of that crime was pedophilic in its nature. Not in its direct nature, but in its indirect actions on society.